Yeah. Yes, go ahead. Vanakkam, everybody. Welcome to today's session, Drive East, and I am so happy to be hosting this session. I have a very esteemed panel here with me. Everybody. Welcome to today's session. And we have Vidya Natarajan, we have Ahalya Sadgunaratnam, and Sandra Chatterjee here, and it is very wonderful to have these esteemed panelists. Before that, I Vidya Natarajan, on and get feedback from somebody. It's stopped now. Okay, good. Thank you very much. So it's great to have you all here on the last day of our Drive East series. We're going to talk about politics and art, and we're going to talk about a lot more than that as well. The politics that really unites these women is Indian dance, but it's also women's bodies. The politics that has been done with women continues to be done as well. So I'm hoping that I'm very sure we'll have a great discussion. So without much further ado, I'm going to ask Vidya Natarajan to start the series. So please introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your research. And we're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pratibha. Vanakkam, everybody, and namaste. My name is Vidya. I had the privilege of studying for about 25 to 30 years with Isai Velala teachers of dance in South India before I immigrated to Canada. And I teach English and writing here at this point, and I also teach dance in a private studio. I wrote a novel about the history of dance. It's something that's concerned me and bothered me for many years. So it was published in 2018. It was called The Undoing Dance. I'm going to read from a presentation for a few minutes. And once I'm done reading, I will also sort of respond to questions and so on. I've called my short presentation, Learning from Auntie in Studio One, Bharatnatyam and the Unresisting Subject. What I'm going to say today is not tested by empirical research. It's based on observations I have made from my limited perspective as a Bharatanatyam instructor in a little town called London, Ontario, Canada. I'm presenting what are becoming central research questions for me today, rather than answers to them. I've taught a small handful of beginner students from a variety of cultural backgrounds, but since I do not want to build a relationship with the local Hindu mandir, and since dance forms from India are still largely tied in with Hinduism here, I tend to teach students who have already learned for some years with other instructors. My advanced students are almost all university attending women and men of Indian or South Asian descent. When I paid my first rent check for studio space and announced my class, I was excited and curious. It seemed to me then that the inscription upon the dancers' bodies of the discipline of Bharatanatyam, but in this disorienting context of a Canadian city, would yield a certain kind of resistant questioning and destabilization of cultural assumptions. In response, Bharatanatyam, I thought, would flex and reform and adapt itself around the dancers' project to carve out an empowering cultural space for themselves. Bharatanatyam could become a critique of racial inequalities, hegemonic colonialism, and gendered bodily practices. But the Bharatanatyam adventure that could have yielded pedagogic moments of great intensity and an aesthetic that developed at the interface of body, ethnicity, cultural history, gender, neoliberal social freedoms, and critical analysis, frustratingly devolved into a patchwork of half-learned and soon forgotten repertoire whose historical provenance was barely understood. My research questions, therefore, arise from my bafflement at my own failure to engage skilled performers who would also shape a critical feminist Bharatanatyam practice. This is not in any way an indictment of individual students. It is a reflection on an ethos or milieu. So what are the reasons why the Bharatanatyam studio in Canada remains a space that supports conservatism and patriarchally mediated femininity? I would hypothesize that one important reason is the reluctance of grant-making bodies and arts councils here to fully recognize dances other than ballet and contemporary Western dance as serious artistic forms. Bharatanatyam competes for state funding alongside other expressions of colorful ethnic singularity, with top marks going to charmingly over-the-top costumes. Since there is no professional pathway for Bharatanatyam dancers, they tend to invest in studying the form far less than they invest in their academic disciplines. In other words, since it's a hobby, students tend to sideline their Bharatanatyam class whenever there are exams or busy periods in their academic lives. And the result is that progress in the class is sporadic, elements of technique are never fully mastered. Another possible reason for the prettiness of some Canadian Bharatanatyam productions is that current practice demands that young South Asians, especially women, be willing to occupy a certain subject position. This subject position, this identity, defined under the pressure of an earlier generation's response to cultural loss and molded by a dance pedagogy that gives the teacher a nearly tyrannical power over the student, involves acceptance of a reified feminine role in the preservation of a reified Indianness or Tamilness or Hinduness in the West. Crucial to this passive acceptance is a lack of awareness of the contentious and layered history of Bharatanatyam in its own setting, in its old setting. Its appropriation by upper caste women from stigmatized Isai Valara practitioners from the 1930s, its highly gendered symbolic role within nationalist discourse, its entanglement in the projection of Indian cultural identity at festivals of India and in other countries from the 1980s onwards, and so on. The Bharatanatyam practice I have encountered in Canada tends not to be self-critical or politically resistant. One of the ways in which this problem is made visible is the dancer's failure to move during class practice, composition, or performance beyond self-objectification. To experience themselves as subjects fully in the moment with bodily efficacy and authenticity, rather than as objects reflected in somebody else's gaze, dancers focus ferociously on either technical virtuosity or on the emotional content of what they are interpreting. Among the Isai Valala teachers that I learned from, self-consciousness was deflected by an impersonal, highly stylized presentation. Their movements had a quality of detachment. Instead of acting out emotions, they enacted states, relationships, and actions. The young Indo-Canadian dancers I have watched, by and large, turn to neither of these options. The emotions they are called upon to produce are embedded in a cultural matrix that is unfamiliar to them. While many of them move well, the kind of technical virtuosity that truly excludes self-objectification is beyond their reach, given their low level of investment in the dance. Bharatanatyam teachers in Canada, as far as I can make out, vigorously promote their own authority as final and run their classes with a degree of autocracy that would not be acceptable to their students in any other pedagogic context. The dance class tends to be a place of unquestioning respect. Despite much cajoling, I have not been able to get my 20-something students to call me anything other than auntie, which at one stroke signals respect and assimilates the dance instructor into the world of home and family rather than the world of professional relations and education. Since most dance teachers typically occupy the space of inquiry, there is also no room for independent research. Even dance history is entirely mediated by the teachers, and many students are already well primed with the idea that the dance form has an unbroken 2,000-year history. The non-physical part of the syllabus, dignified by the term theory, is still invariably driven by some notional connection between Bharata's Natya Shastra and living practice today. So the possibility of resisting the danced material or even of understanding where the repertoire comes from is foreclosed by Brahminical pedagogy on the one hand and by the lack of exposure to history, to critical theory from contemporary theorists of dance, or from cultural studies or other disciplines on the other. Unlike at the University of California in Los Angeles, for example, or at Roehampton University in the UK, or in other academic centers, where a critical, actively post-colonial critique of and through Bharatanatyam has sneaked in, there is not enough of a critical mass of Bharatanatyam scholars in Canada who are making theoretical and critical interventions related to identity, race, or gender. And essentialized Hinduism stubbornly remains at the core of what Susan McNaughton calls the transnational aesthetic. While the latter is embraced through the use of updated costuming or multimedia projection, or apparently feminist themes and narratives, most productions still loop back around to allegory or mysticism or mythology from which the eternally reliable and genteel tropes of wifehood and motherhood of Sita and Kode and Draupadi can always be drawn. Since all these characters are also mediated by the teacher, who performs the role of the community's keeper of culture, the result is a performance of femininity that's far from resistant. Featuring girls and young women from middle to upper middle class backgrounds who face neither an audition nor any rigorous critique of their performance, Bharatanatyam productions sometimes become an exercise in parental self-gratification. So enduring is the video recording as a repository of cultural affiliation that the body of the dancer no longer needs to train or discipline itself enough or perform over a long period of time. The expensive arangetram is now the goal of the training rather than the beginning. Meena Khandelwal notes that as young Indian Americans or Canadians navigate their liminal inside-outside cultural space, dance that is approved of by parents because it underlines ethnic identity, and by non-ethnic peers because it is in itself aesthetically appealing, becomes a way of being both good and cool. But since Bollywood covers all this so well, and since the investment in forms like Bharatanatyam has to be so immense to pay off, the dancers who are most likely to bring critical curiosity to this form, who fully experience their liminality and ache for full participation in cultural neoliberalism, tend to gravitate towards skills easily learned in a matter of weeks rather than years. As for the most subversively inclined dancers, I don't think they're to be found in the Bharatanatyam studio at all. They have pierced their tongues and eyebrows and got a couple of tattoos and struggled into their distressed Daisy Dukes, and they are ripping up the hip hop studio down the road alongside partners of completely unacceptable gender and ethnicity. I'm passing the mic back to Pratibha.
Wow.
Thank you,
Wow. Thank you, Vidya. That was an excellent start. So I'm going to turn the floor to Sandra Chatterjee, who is joining us from Munich. Welcome, Sandra. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pratibha. Thank you so much, Vidya, for this beautiful presentation. I'm really glad I'll be speaking a lot more casually because there's no way I can write so beautifully. So thank you for this invitation to join this session and to talk a little bit about, well, yes, my research, but also sort of the fuel that's been fueling my dance practice since I can think. So though we were invited as scholars, I do also take the liberty to speak as a practitioner. And similar to what Vidya was saying, my research questions and what I write about is so inextricably linked to my practice and grows out of what I observe in practicing dance that I really wouldn't be able to separate it anyways. So yes, I've jumped into the presentation a little bit, but since I will be talking from my position, I think the presentation itself might serve as a kind of introduction simultaneously. So like you said, I am currently speaking from Munich. I work in Munich as well as Austria. So at the University of Salzburg, but really it's only 2 hours apart, but a different country. And I spend a lot of time in India and work in India. So talking about Diaspora, the German and the Austrian or more the German situation would really be the reference point. UCLA, where I got my PhD, is another reference point. So I'm very glad that, Vidya, you already addressed that, because I will be referring back to that as well in my presentation. So basically, I do read a little bit once in a while. Basically, I will be speaking about the context of the Indian or South Asian diaspora in Germany primarily, but if you really think of diaspora as a community that has dispersed from the homeland, but keeps an active connection to this homeland, it's a little bit tricky to talk about Germany in this context, because since Germany has never been, or has not for a long time been, a kind of major destination for migration from India or the subcontinent, it doesn't really possess the same pull factors for migration and the same kind of community as, for example, the US, Canada, or the UK, or some countries in the Middle East, for example, or even Australia. So in the early 2000s, the number of Indians living in Germany was relatively small, probably less than 50,000 Indian citizens, compared to say more like 2 million people of Turkish origin. So it's very small, and also the community is a little bit mixed. Urmila Goel, who is who teaches European ethnology in Berlin, she kind of explained this as being a group or a community that is more bound together by not belonging to Germany in a specific way, or to Germanness in a specific way, which is mediated by perceived or real Indianness, or not real, I mean, what is real Indianness? By perceived Indianness, or an actual connection to India or the subcontinent. So it's actually drawing together Indians, half Indians like me, I'm half German and half Indian. People who are from Bangladesh, Hindus from Afghanistan, for example, Sri Lankans, people who've been adopted. So it's a kind of heterogeneous group, and while there is some sort of community structures happening, there's also a lot more dispersal and isolation within that. And so it's kind of, on some level, she connects it via an experience of othering more than an experience of a shared homeland in some ways. Though I must also say that this has been changing, because migration patterns and dynamics have changed. So there's a lot more migration from India and the subcontinent to Germany. So I am actually speaking at the moment where this dynamic in this community is changing, but I don't really have the distance yet to kind of evaluate that. So I just want to say that. So I do also teach classical Indian dance. I teach Bharatnatyam and Kuchipudi in a very small group, and it's also a mixed group of some Indian students and some students from other backgrounds. So my own experience of studying dance here was one of isolation. I was my teacher's only student. I did my Ranga Pravesham in Kuchipudi. At that time, nobody really knew what Kuchipudi was here. So that whole feeling that also we encountered about that, creating a community, creating a connection to the homeland that is somehow collective, was not part of my experience. So again, this is changing, but kind of moving to California and living, like being at UCLA for a while, has really made me understand the difference of what would it mean to be part of a diasporic community, and what would it be to be of also an artistic community where there is, even though it's correct, there is very little that is also funded, there's a big competition, there is very little professionalism, but just to even have the experience that there can be that sort of dialogue, there can be that sort of exchange. And then coming back to the situation of isolation, has been very specific and very striking. So in my research, I think what happened upon returning from the US to Europe is that I was searching for colleagues in Europe who were also working. And so I did a research project called Traversing the Contemporary, where I looked at the work of colleagues in continental Europe, and there's very few and far between, who were also working on contemporary dance, but trained in Bharatnatyam. So I looked at the work of Rani Nair, for example, in Sweden, of Kalpana Raghunaman in The Hague. So it was really a way of finding the other colleagues who are working on the same issues or similar questions. So basically, back to my experience, in some ways, dancing in Germany or dancing in the diaspora, I compared it to constantly dancing out of context, though in some way it creates a context. But basically, in addition to the labor of actually dancing and all the blood, sweat, and tears that is involved in mastering the technique, there's also this labor of creating the context, of bridging a distance, of bridging a culture and geographic distance, but also, bridging displacement, and also which is a kind of emotional labor. And while I know that labor might be a hard word for it, because the reason why we do is that we also get the pleasure of it. But it is a labor specifically in the face of adversities, of the face of challenges, in the face of racist structures, in the face of exoticism, in the face of patriarchal structures and the patriarchal sort of expectations of reproducing home through the female body. Which you also mentioned already, Vidya, so I won't get into that in detail, but that's what I really looked at in detail in my dissertation in California. So interestingly, though, my recent work has really looked a little bit more at time. And so there's another labor involved here, I feel, and one is sort of the labor of trying to enter the now, enter the present, enter the cutting edge of artistic production on some level, enter what you call sort of professionalized, serious artistic work, breaking through that. So in a sense, it's also dancing out of time, because you're constantly relegated to a past and reliving a past or recreating a past. And at the same time, I feel like in Europe, you're still not part of local dance history. So you are recreating a past, but you are denied entry into history and archives. And that is kind of the current work that I'm doing, is in terms of like, what are the memories? How can we also establish a presence in the local here? So I think I would like to end it at that.
Wow, that was a powerful speech. Thank you so much, Sandra. Now I'm going to yield the floor to Ahalya. Ahalya, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pratibha, and thank you so much for gathering us all together, Vidya and Sandra. It's so wonderful to share this platform with you. I hope my work will touch on many of the points that were brought up. I first just want to say, my name is Ahalya Satkaneratnam. I'm here in what is called Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, which are the traditional occupied and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I want to acknowledge this geographical space because colonization is also very much part of the history and the discussion that we are talking about today when it comes to politics and dance. So today I'm asked to speak about Sri Lanka. I'm also a dancer who was born in Malaysia of Sri Lankan descent, who has lived in Canada and the US primarily. And I have written a book called Moving Bodies, Navigating Conflict, which is about dance in Sri Lanka. And I'm just going to read a short excerpt, but today my presentation is a little more loose. I'm trying to move into that format. And I'll just bring up some points from from my work there and also tie it to where I am here. So from an outside perspective, Bharatnatyam may be viewed simply as an Indian dance form that migrated to the island nation of Sri Lanka. It is in part a reconstructed and revived Indian national dance produced from the temple dance tradition of the Devadasis, the matriarchal community of temple performing artists. But in Sri Lanka, however, when we think about the dance practice, we have to insert the practice into a different context, that of war, which amplifies allegiance to land, history, and people. Disparate readings of the island's history form the rationale for the contemporary conflict, entwining religious and linguistic arguments with historical ones. The Sri Lankan dancer engages directly with this rationale, entwining similarly religious references and language choices from the war, along with their own experience to produce a counter-cultural response, creating their own measure and rationale of the politics of nation, dance, their own bodies, and the war. So today, I would like us to think about colonization as an important framing for understanding Bharatnatyam, not only in India, but in the settler colonies and diaspora we may find ourselves, that we have to consider this history and this long history and also the history of ourselves in these lands. And I want us to think about Indian culture elsewhere as not simply a replication, but holding distinct meaning for the local, temporal, geographical context. And that's part of the work that I've done in looking at Bharatnatyam practice in Colombo, Sri Lanka during the war. The ways in which I will speak about Bharatnatyam today is to discuss how this form was shaped by the colonial encounter, and that is an economic shift. And we've talked a little bit about labor. So the shift of what is artistic labor from court and temple form to one that is individually accessed through a public proscenium stage or through independent artists, right? Who are now owning a type of form removed from a community, or they become the harbors, the bearers of community, right? A shift in the social practice from a matrilineal society through personal exchanges of individual dance teachers, families, schools, and teachers. And I think, Vidya, your book illuminates that so beautifully, so richly, actually, for us to discuss today. And I perceive the shift in economy changes the meaning of the dance. And we've heard this at the beginning, at the opening, and is reflective of who can do the form, thinking about the funding, the marketplaces for this dance form in the settler colony, in Sri Lanka, and in India, right? The second component that I want to discuss is how the form is racialized. And when we think about racialization, we have to think about how our identities are created. And these identities return to that notion of colonization, the encounters with government, schooling, family, religion, caste, nation. What are the correct forms of Tamil culture, of Tamil bodies, and how these can be exclusive? So we know that Bharatnatyam was constructed in the early 20th century as an Indian form, and its association to Sanskrit through this association with the treaties, the Natya Shastra, in the development of the form in the early 20th century, allowed it to be considered a pan-Asian form, which is very important for us to understand the early practices of the form in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lankans do not consider themselves as Indian diaspora. So that's one thing I just want to point out, is that their framing of self is different from that. And the notion of diaspora in Sri Lanka is already contested, because when we have an ethnic conflict, the idea of belonging is central, right? Is central to the civil war of Sri Lanka between the Tamil Tigers and the predominantly Sinhala Buddhist government of Sri Lanka. So the other point that I want to bring is that Bharatnatyam embodies this local politics, one that is shaped by war in Sri Lanka. And outside, when we think about Sri Lankans outside of Sri Lanka, we can consider that racialization of the Sri Lankan body as immigrants and refugees in these other places. And I think, Sandra, your discussion talks about that experience in these many places of home. So I have only a few minutes to speak, but I want to share particularly the dynamic issues of Sri Lanka, one of war and also Tamil nationalism and separatism. And I'm looking at kind of the dominant practices of the form, but there are always unique stories and exceptions to these normative practices. And I think all the speakers have discussed that through themselves, and their own interventions in these nationalist formats of performing arts. So we know in Sri Lanka that there are Devadasis practicing the form of Sadir in temples in Colombo in the early 20th century. And like their counterparts in Tamil Nadu, they were advocating for themselves and their practice valued through this long history. So the Devadasis in Colombo were arguing that their practice should continue during the anti-Nach movement through their own lineage to antiquity, right? Because that was the framing, that was the rationale and the logic of argument of relevance, right? Is that I am historically relevant, so now you can understand me and my body and my art as necessary. In the early 20th century, the association of dance, of Bharatnatyam as a reconstructed form, as a pan-Asian form tied to the Natya Shastra, allowed dancers from many different backgrounds, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Tamil, Sinhala, to access this form. And now in Colombo, we have Muslim practitioners, Tamil practitioners, Christian practitioners, again, a very diverse grouping of people who are accessing the form, this reconstructed form. One of the earliest practitioners in Sri Lanka was Sinhala and Buddhist, and she studied at Kalakshetra. And Kalakshetra is an institution created through the colonial encounter, right? Created a regulated curriculum, thought of the dance as Pan-Asian, created a Pan-Asian student body, and had a very Sanskritic aesthetic. By 1950, we have the All Island Dance Festival in Sri Lanka. And this is also mimicked in many what are called post-colonial nations, right? Where dance becomes the symbol of the nation, right? So in 1950, Bharatnatyam is even considered an indigenous dance form to Sri Lanka, right? And the term indigenous is important here. By 1955, with the rise of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism after independence, we have the creation, the chosen creation of a Sri Lankan dance form called Kandyan dance that was taken from a ritual Buddhist practice of male drummers and transformed into a proscenium stage dance form. Right? And the reason for the creation of that dance form was to counter the popularity of Bharatnatyam that was spreading across women of caste and class across difference of ethnicity. So there was the creation of Kandyan dance to kind of curtail the popularity of Bharatnatyam. By 1970s, you have the implementation of Bharatnatyam and Kandyan dance as a required subject in the public schools. This access to the dance and the regulated forms, you have testing, you have this curriculum that is built, a regulated curriculum that is built through the dance form. Through the schooling that is now part of the dance form. And then we have to think, who's learning Kandyan dance, who's learning Bharatnatyam, and that spread becomes uneven, right? So Tamil bodies in Tamil medium schools aren't accessing Kandyan dance, but Bharatnatyam becomes available in a lot of in a lot of Sinhala medium schools, right? In 1983, you have what is called Black July, where thousands of Tamils would flee the country in response to a police-supported program where mobs violently targeted Tamil houses and businesses in Colombo. And that marks the official start of the war. We know, though, that there were ethnic tensions and riots happening for many decades prior to this, right? And this is a time and period of loss on what we would call both sides, right? Tamil and Sinhala peoples. So we have the marking of the diaspora from that time, but we also know Sri Lankan Tamil people were in diaspora in Malaysia and Singapore because of colonialism, because of British Empire. So now in thinking about war, we have to think about the exodus of people. And when we have the exodus of people, we have a change in neighborhoods. We have the forcing of people to move. There are safe and unsafe territories within what was a home, Colombo. So people's relationships to home change. Their ideas of belonging shift, right? And when Bharatnatyam becomes a symbol of Tamilness, right, through this division between Kandyan and Bharatnatyam dance, the government can also position itself as neutral or accepting by showcasing this dance form as a penultimate minority dance form, right? So ethnically Sinhala dancers can share Bharatnatyam, and then Tamil dancers I've spoken to felt marginalized continuously because their bodies were not necessary to showcase this dance form, right? So in dance, another point that I wanted to bring up is that you can see the use of tradition to discuss war without an obvious political angle. And that the notion of tradition, I think Vidya talked about it, like this repeated repertoire, potentially without thinking. And at the same time, we can think about how that repertoire becomes a way of blocking a political discussion because it hides the politics, right? The repertoire is already politicized, and then we use that repertoire to hide a contemporary politics, that contemporary politics of war. The use of tradition is also a means to maintain a sense of culture and pride in opposition to nation. So we have dance forms, we have dance practices in Bharatnatyam that are highlighting Tamil separatism and highlighting the narratives of the Tamil tigers. We also know that dance, just like all of us as artists, become an access to a type of power, right? Dance as a notion that we can, if we participate, we can participate in the public sphere. And I also wanted to bring up that funding and this marketplace of economy is so integral to this. So soon after the war ended in 2009, I'll just bring up an example. The Indian High Commission commissioned a piece from a local Bharatnatyam dancer based in Colombo and said, you can only dance this, we will only fund the Sinhala language format of this dance practice, not the Tamil language one. And so we have, you know, funding shaping how this dance form is used, and that is political. It's chosen to make alliances between governments. And these types of choices that are happening on the higher level also create anxieties for the local dancer, right? The dancer who says, oh, how can I only dance in this language and not the other? What does that mean? How will people perceive me, right? And we're talking about those experiences today. And the last points that I just wanted to bring about in terms of the diaspora and being of the diaspora myself located here in what is called Canada, I want to think a lot about how the framing of this dance as historical continues to be the dance's currency, right? That we have this ancient lineage is the only way in which we have currency and value. And we've internalized that logic. But the dance also creates a sense of stability when we are immigrants, when we are refugees. It creates a sense of belonging in these communities. And that when we think about, we as practitioners can also compete in this marketplace. We can say who is the real holder of tradition, right? So we start policing each other over our behaviors and our practices. And the last point I want to make, if I still have some time, is that, recently I was asked to participate in a program in Vancouver, and the funder received monies for anti-racism, right? And in the end, this heritage grant, the producer thought, oh, if all the dancers just show us the basic steps of their dance form, is that not anti-racism? And here I brought a piece that was about from a poet friend of mine who's based in Sri Lanka that talks about police brutality in Sri Lanka to tie in with Black Lives Matter, and that was completely erased from the platform. Right. So the notion of anti-racism even becomes something that, the white producer, the white world, right, that has created this capital economy, we're sitting here telling them that what anti-racism means to us, and they're telling us what it means in a way that shows us what racialization is. So I hope that my loosely framed presentation touches on many points that were discussed earlier, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, absolutely. The battle might have ended, but the struggle continues. And it's beautiful that you brought that up, which it ties me into the next question, since you're from Canada. And it's interesting because you say, I am from the land that is called Canada, right? And I know Vidya is also from the land called Canada, at least she lives there now. So this question is for you, Vidya. You talk about cultural appropriation, right? Both in the context of Bharatnatyam and in terms of the land back movement of the indigenous people of Canada. And you're a very strong vocal advocate of this. I'm going to shift gears here and kind of trace it back to the motherland and ask, how do you see this appropriation change in terms of how has it manifested with the Indian politics leaning far right now? And how do you think this affects how Bharatnatyam is being taught and performed, practiced in North America as well? I mean, I know that's a very generalized question, but I know that the movement, the move towards the far right in India is affecting the arts and how they are being practiced. So I want to get your thoughts on that.
I haven't actually had enough time to theorize that, sort of articulate what I really feel fully. I know that I want to distance myself from such practitioners as use the form in order to promote far right or Hindutva ideology. What I think, just going back to the history of the form and the idea of appropriation, it's only very recently, with the language that indigenous people across the world have given us, that we are really able to go back and look at the history of Bharatanatyam as a matter of appropriation, that particular technical term and everything that it implies of depriving someone of a livelihood and taking over their form or something that was their heritage and turning it into a commercial proposition for a different group of people. That particular language, I think, is going to help us critique the way in which the form is used. And I think what you are pointing to is a new twist to that appropriation, the appropriation of the form. And despite the fact that its earlier ritual religious use is now condemned, and people are distancing themselves from all of that, and in the name of a pure morality or a certain kind of femininity and patriarchy, religious patriarchy. What we have is a new form of assimilation of these dances to promote Hindu mythology, to promote so-called Hindu culture. And a lot of that is actually Hindutva, because it leaves out of the equation a number of the elements that were part of the original practice. So this is a completely reformulated thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, because people have to reformulate and reinvent their arts all the time in a contemporary context. But I think what bothers me about this is the self-righteousness and the appropriation of it to purposes that deliberately marginalize or further perpetrate violence on people from other religions and cultures within India and in the diaspora.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well said. So actually, that's a nice segue into my next question for Sandra. Sandra, I was reading your dissertation, and it's interesting that women always say, "Oh, I'm not that good at this sort. I'm not that as good as this." And you mentioned that you're not a good writer. I call BS on that because I read your dissertation. It is beautifully written. I haven't read any of your published articles, but your dissertation was very well written. So I'm going to, because I would butcher it if I were paraphrasing it. I'm going to read from this. You were talking about a piece that you studied as part of your dissertation, and it was about a husband. It was about a useless husband piece, to put it in context. And you're talking about throughout the piece, when the words about the husband are being sung, my challenge to myself as a dancer is to avoid at all cost giving in to the rhythm of the words. I force myself to deafen my impulses to move with the rhythm. So essentially you're talking about unlearning the conventions that have become automatic impulses, right? I mean, those are your words. So it's often that, even when I hear our sensibilities are developing, I mean, we are evolving as humans, as a human race. And things that were appropriate at some point in history are so cringeworthy now, right? So for example, so my question is, how do you think we should continue to unlearn in this context with what has now become, what was traditionally relevant, but now an almost improper phenomenon? So just to put an example into this, let's talk about a Mugdhanayika. They talk about, so for example, there is a piece where a very young, like a preteen kind of girl talks about Muvagopala, this guy, Krishna, of course. And she tells her friend, oh, yesterday he called me into his room or his place, and he did all these kinds of things to me, but I am really young. I'm afraid to go back there, so why don't you go there today if he calls you? I mean, when you think of that, I mean, the sensibility today would say, okay, that's pedophilia, that's inappropriate, right? Or a padam that is like ettanai sonnalum, where the mother tells the daughter, what if your husband hits you? He is still your husband. Go back to him, right? Those kinds of things. So, I say, with things unfortunately becoming a little bit more regressive in practice, be it for the sake of funding or be it for the sake of Hindu politics or whatever. So how do you see we can challenge ourselves to unlearn these traditions that we now realize, some of these traditions that we now realize are not just irrelevant, but just improper?
Thanks for that question. It's throwing me a little bit for a loop because I haven't actually read my dissertation probably in about a decade. I wrote it really long ago, but I don't think I need to answer the question just based on the dissertation. Well, what I did, though, going back to the dissertation, theoretically, the framework that I used was called undomesticating the body. In a sense, I was going back to this sort of idea of the labor of homemaking by performing certain values, certain narratives, certain type of femininity. I think, to answer your question 10 years, 15 years later, I've actually pretty much distanced myself completely from those narratives. Like, they're no longer part of my practice at all.
How would you enter
literature a little bit, but like, yes.
how would you encourage others to let go of things? Like for example, I mean, we all go through this journey, be it belief in a particular religious system or whatever. We have to go through our journeys, and at some point, either take them or discard them. But there is a lot that has been taught to us, and it takes a lot to unlearn. Because I mean, like Ahalya was saying, we take things for granted, right?
Yes.
So how do you have any advice on how do you unlearn these kinds of things? How do you start questioning things?
Right. I try to remember different things, I think. Bring different narratives, different stories, different histories to the, to give them a presence. I think that probably for me personally has been the most effective because this impulse that you quoted from the dissertation, I think that is something that has to really come from within. That's like that active, like actually going through the motion of resisting physically. And that was a journey that took years because in the first few years of trying to create my own work and trying to tell my own stories and trying to tell different stories and trying to kind of find an artistic voice as a woman within or beyond those narratives that I was taught was very, very difficult because they were paralyzing as well. So I think it was really encountering other stories, other artists' work, different kinds of memories, different information that helped me build up to the sort of desire to resist physically and then go embark on that journey, which was a difficult one. So I think my main advice would be, or my main method has been of unlearning is learning different things, remembering different things, and bringing them into dialogue and maybe also creating a dissonance, raising questions by presenting different materials, I think.
Right. Especially because as women and as female dancers as well, especially of an art form like Bharatnatyam or Kuchipudi, for example, we're taught to not just follow certain body language, but also codify certain languages as well, right? For example, if you are a Bharatnatyam dancer, there is an internalized racism where you choose certain colors for costumes. You are more valued if you are of a certain skin color. If you change the way you talk in Tamil to appease to the ruling class, for lack of a better word, I'll just say that, to take on the identity of somebody else who's more of a class that is more successful or that is more prominent. Right. So it's all about questioning those things. So thank you for that. So Ahalya, that brings me to you. So you talk about women dancers and how their bodies have been used to navigate this conflict. And it's interesting because in your book, one of the testimonies to your book was talking about the hegemony of the art of an art form that exists within India, right? There is a hegemony in Bharatnatyam, for example. There's the hegemony in Carnatic music as well. But then you're talking about the hegemony of how that art form, which is now considered so pure and pristine when it is in India, takes on a completely different role in the Sri Lankan politics as well. How do you think? Do you think it is erasing the history in the current politics? Is trying to erase the history of Bharatnatyam by making it more Sinhala oriented, or do you think it is being it is trying to help it grow and evolve? There are two sides to that coin.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the logic of how Bharatanatyam was created still haunts us so deeply, right? All of us. that logic of this is how we must argue for our relevance. This is the form, and we will take it from this place. We will monetize it in this way. So that logic of history, that logic of tradition still haunts us. So when we think about it in Sri Lanka, I wouldn't say it's different from the logic that created the Indian national penultimate form. That logic still exists. Practitioners, though, they may be very resistant in many ways to nationalism, to war, to ethnic chauvinism and communalism, to that type of violence. Practitioners may have real problems with the state, right? But how does that show up in the dance form? Maybe more internal than external, right? So because we are all living in that economy where we have to find a way to live, we have men that are lost to war. We have the need for our children to leave the country, right? We have to keep some sort of living. Bharatnatyam teaching becomes a respectable form of income earning, right? So we're living in that practice, right? We're living in that capital economy. And one of the things I think Vidya, spoke to this too is, when we think about post-colonial, it's still colonial, right? It actually isn't that resistant to what those colonial frameworks were, which is, that Asia is really old, it's spiritual, it's all of these, beautiful things that we value, right? And we don't think about caste. We don't want to associate those types of traditions. We don't want to think about our own caste, right? But the logic of the form is maintained. Although I think in Sri Lanka, it's used in a particular local economy. It's used in a particular local politics. And that can be said even here, right? But in some ways, when I brought up that last point of anti-racism, it's that logic that continues to exist and haunt us. And we need to find a way to resist it. We need to find a decolonial way of existing. And I don't think we can even come back, that idea of returning, of repatriating the form. I don't know if we can get to that place. And even if we get to that place, how we get to it will take on the history of getting to that there, and will shape that meaning.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have some questions from people here that are pouring in. So I love this question. I think Nadia has asked this. How do we as artists or organizations give voice to those who are marginalized either in their home countries or by the upper caste dance communities? And what work do we do in addition to reading and learning? And in this, I'm going to tag on one of my own questions as well. Where do we begin our reading? What are some suggestions that you guys can give us on where do we get started with learning about what is the true history of Bharatnatyam, what is the true politics of Bharatnatyam, and how do we improve ourselves? How do we bring that to take that to the next level? Vidya, do you want to begin? I'm going to just point out.
Sure. I don't think there is a true politics of Bharatnatyam or of anything. I think there are multiple political positions. And as Ahalya pointed out, even today, when you look at the history of Bharatnatyam, it's been appropriated in two different ways, in two different contexts, in Tamil Nadu, for example, and in Colombo. So I think there's no unitary advice or discourse that one can sort of, lay down. And I think it would really depend on how each individual practitioner approached this question of empowering other people rather than holding on to power and privilege for themselves. My own solution, my own life's journey in some sense has been to steal Ahalya's word, but to twist it, not repatriating, but rematriating this form back to its, its female practitioners, if such a thing is even possible. They, the voices I hear today from South India are not speaking the old language. Of course, they are not identifying as Ishe women in the old form. They are identifying themselves very differently. But I think for me, the immediate activism is listening to their voices, amplifying their voices as much as I can, and seeing to what extent their practice can become a way of critiquing the practice of everybody else. So rather than turning to a book at this point, I mean, there are many, many recently published books. I love Devesh Soneji's book, for example. I wrote my own Undoing Dance, partly because I wanted people to think about history and to arrive at the contemporary or at the present through a different route from the one that's normally taken through the practices of Brahmin nationalism. So let that go and come to the present through a different path and see what it has meant to Ishe women. But rather than all of that, right now, my own preoccupation is with making space for people not only from Ishe backgrounds, but to see what we can do to allow people of any caste or any background or any financial status access to this form, which has so far been very much the playground of privileged people. So that's my overall thought.
Thank you.
Passing it on to Ahalya.
Thank you. I agree, and I love the idea of rematriation. Thank you, Vidya, for that. Yes, I mean, I think that we have to consider who are we learning from and what their value systems are. And I think if you want to find something that is invested in Hindutva, is invested in class ascendancy, you can find it easily. Finding those practitioners who are invested in anti-racism, who live in a framework of thinking about colonialism and caste issues in our own communities is different, and you may get a different experience with that. I do think what I loved about some of the Drive East programming and hearing about the practitioners is that we see practitioners, we see, when we see artists who are really dealing with inhumanity, right? Who are wanting to address that. And I don't want to negate the fact that they have those experiences and they have those feelings. And so one of the concerts was there was a piece about Black Lives Matter in a Carnatic form. And I thought that was quite beautiful that people want to bring up this issue through what is constructed classical practice, right? And so I appreciate that because our communities are so anti-Black, because our communities have real caste issues, right? And really have for a long time trying to find themselves aligned with whiteness more than Blackness, right? And so I appreciate that type of movement. But I do think that we have to consider who we learn from, what histories we want to learn. And it's not just to know, oh, that this form came this way, but why am I doing this form? Why do I continue to do it this way? And then you end up, if you try hard enough, you end up and you're trying to be an artist in this economy that is also going to cheat you out. So then we have to, it's like we have to really think about coalition building. We have to think about what we're doing with our arts practice. And the survival becomes a fine balance.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'm going to, we're almost out of time. We're actually out of time, but I do have one burning question from one of our viewers. So Sandra, if you want to take it, and then the rest of you can also chime in. She says, I'm curious what music you guys use, considering that the majority of music used for Bharatnatyam or Kuchipudi, in your case, is Carnatic music with strong themes from the Puranas and the mythological stories. So in your practice, what do you use?
Okay, let me take this. Actually, I have to say that I have not been performing classical dance for a very, very long time. So I'm not actually sure I'm the right person to answer this question. The more contemporary work I've been doing over the last few years has often worked more with sounds, sounds of rain, sound of crows, sounds like that. I've also worked with the music of friends of mine who are beautiful musicians and whose work also content-wise really resonates with me. And to just mention two of them, one is Oliver Rajamani, who lives in Texas, and very recently I've danced. Or I've started dancing to music again in a contemporary way very recently, because I had exactly this. It probably speaks to the question I had dropped the music and the narratives from the work. Very recently, I've started working with and just actually now during the lockdown and dancing to the music of a musician from Kolkata called Orko Mukherjee. So that has sort of brought music back into my work, but has nothing to do with classical or Carnatic, or usually the work that's the music that's associated with classical dance.
Vidya, what kind of music do you use?
I'm going to beat my old drum again, I'm afraid. The music used by Isabella women was I would say about 70% of it was secular. It was one of the problems Rukmini Arundel had with that music, that it was what she called narastuti, that it praised human beings, men, or people who were not superhuman or not gods. So even though sometimes the tagline could be a Muva Gopala, or it might reference a god, pretty much all the content tends to be secular. So you can perform it as if you are performing an everyday situation. And to just add a variation to your question about padams like Yetane Sonalum, or Adikadi Kaye Pidikirari Variaradi Sakye, that kind of padam, today it is in some sense what we would think of as abusive behavior on the part of a man, but it also does capture role playing, because I also see dancing as an opportunity to occupy a different body and a different psyche from the one I actually have. So I get a certain amount of pleasure from pretending to be someone I absolutely am not. I would never tell my daughter, if I had one, to accept being abused by her partner. But it's sort of fun for me to do that in such a way that the mother there looks like a caricature, a bit parodic, a bit ghastly, and someone that nobody would find very sympathetic. So I have, once in a while I have fun. But the Isabella repertoire is very, very rich in thematic content, not just Puranic.
Right. Absolutely. In fact, I've been recently working on uncovering padams that were written by Ponnaya Pillai on Aindinai. And they're completely secular, right? Because it follows the codification of the Sangam period. So it's completely on the landscape, the flora, fauna, and then the love between a man and a woman, or the hero telling the charioteer, go quickly, my love is waiting for me, I promised her I will be there, everyday situations. So and they're just so beautifully written. It doesn't have to always be there's not, to me, nothing is wrong with Narastuti anyway, but if we are the if God is within us, as some people call it, there's nothing wrong with that anyway. So that brings me to the final question, and I will have each of you take about a minute to answer this. You're all living in different, you're not living in the subcontinent, India or Sri Lanka, in South Asia, rather. the dance that you are doing is still, or you're trained in, is still seen as exotic, right? So how do you cross that barrier? And I mean, to me, exotic sounds, I mean, it might sound like a positive adjective, but it is still an objectification. So how do you accept it, or do you write against it? What do you do? Ahalya?
Oh, I feel like personally, I want to write against it. I think that I want to be I've had difficulty being recognized for working within the form, and for thinking about contemporary issues with the form. And I think that there's still a lot of learning to be done within our communities, but external to our communities as well, outside. And in terms of the reckoning, like for me, I can only do what speaks to me as a dancer. And sometimes that is like, oh, let me look at what is the classical form, and just watch it for a while and think and contemplate it. But also, my time here is limited, right? All of our time on this earth is limited. And I think a lot about what type of work I want to put forward and what type of politics that work resonates with. And to me, that is my mission through creating dance.
Thank you. Sandra, do you want to add to that?
Sure, I can add to that. Yes, so exoticism and being exoticized has probably been the single most sort of driving force personally, like in terms of what I've personally encountered. So yes, most of the contemporary work I do was for a long time dancing against that, but also, and this is what I've realized, and this kind of connects to the current research project I'm doing, which is, and I won't be long, so I'm not introducing a whole new research, but I've already mentioned that we are kind of not part of dance history here locally. And right now we're in a research project in Salzburg. It's called Border Dancing Across Time, and it's looking at a dancer called Nyota Nyoka, who's kind of just in the footnotes of modern dance history. And she was probably half Indian. Her biography is very mysterious. We're doing it at the University of Salzburg again. It's again from the Austrian Science Fund. And so she was really popular during the time that exoticism was popular, and then she sort of disappears from the books. She disappears from the history books. I've also done some work on Amrita Shergill, who lived in Paris, just like Nyota Nyoka, and then moved back to India, and who's also moved back because of this kind of, one of the things that she writes in her letters is about being exoticized. So realizing that this is part of our history in this part of the world as well. And this is like 100 years later, I'm still talking about the same thing that Amrita Shergill was talking about. Like realizing that and remembering that and being like, okay, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's also try to move forward from that and realize the historical structure of that, I think is really important. And it's an important part of bringing this dance into time and into history as well.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll finish up with hearing from Vidya about this.
I've decided that there's no good use fighting against being exoticized in a predominantly white culture. I also live in a very, very, very white town. But one way I try to counter it is to contextualize and politicize my performance. So when I perform, I usually talk about the political history of Bharatnatyam in such a way that it makes people feel that this is real life, people having the same kinds of battles and the same kinds of struggles as everybody else has around them. And this isn't something that's spiritual. I, in fact, do slightly mocking introductions where I laugh at some of those ideas that they already have brought, and I kind of ask them, oh, have you enjoyed your samosas tonight? And kind of, so I do that thing where I laugh at the concept of exoticizing before I begin my show so that they are a little self-conscious about receiving me as an exotic object. I don't perform that much these days, so it's not a huge issue, but making exoticism look kind of archaic and old-fashioned and a little silly might help in the way we frame our performances.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the feminist in you. Well, this has been an amazing, amazing discussion. Thank you all so much for enlightening us. And it has been a wonderful experience picking your brains on various things. And thank you all for joining Drive East. Thank you. Thank you again so much. I know you're all very busy. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thank you for the
Thank you.
Sandra and Ahalya, it was such a pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's such good bringing together, such good curation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I think we might still be online for a few seconds until, we'll still be online for a few seconds just to say goodbyes and all of that. So you can feel